Hi, everybody. Welcome to Drag Racing's Golden Era. My name's Randy. We're happy that you're here with us tonight. Tonight, we finish up our three-part series with Don the Wavemaker Prieto. Now, Don has had just a tremendous amount of information that he's tossed at us, and it's been an outstanding series of interviews here. And I'm just thrilled that he took the time to spend with us. And I'd like to personally thank Don for making this happen for us. We learned so much through his early drag racing career, time with publications and SEMA, and all the very interesting players in the drag racing and the performance aftermarket that Don hung around with and was associated with. So it's been just an outstanding interview, and I hope that you will go back and watch 1 and 2 as well as this part. Now, I went to the Nitro Revival last year, and I have been accused of playing a little bit of favoritism while I was out there by a couple of people, and I will be the first to admit that while it wasn't favoritism, I was definitely overwhelmed in what was going on out there. A lot of these cars I had never seen in person before. Some of them were my absolute favorites. The Sizzler, Mike Cool's car, just to name a couple of them, Harry Burkhalter's Fuel Altered. So I spent an extra amount of time around those cars. Plus, I spent a lot of time filming Bob Moravez and the Fishbowl, and those are Midwestern guys here with me, and Steve Anderson and Greg Barta and the team, and Jerry Newman. They were all Midwestern guys, and so I probably did spend a little bit more time with them than I should have. But my regret is that I didn't take the time to get over to Don Prieto's pit area and get video of him and the Hustler and the Ivo car, the single-engine Buick car. And on the good side of this, I have made my decision that I will be going back to the Nitro Revival this year, and I hope that all of you will consider taking the time and making the trip out there, because out of all the events I've ever been to in my life, I've never seen anything like it. It was, as far as historical drag racing events, and the people that made up that history, I can't imagine there's another event like this on the planet. It was unbelievable. So what I'm hoping is that this year, when I get back out to the Nitro Revival, my coverage won't be as biased as I've been accused of being, and we will actually spend some time with Don Prieto in his pit and get some great video of the Hustler and the Ivo car and startups and all the things that we can do. We've already got a whole bunch of interviews that have already been planned after some people found out I was going to be out there. So I'm very excited about this year's Nitro Revival. And I want to take this just a second here to personally thank Don Prieto for allowing us the time to talk with him and to pick his brain and to just hear these outstanding stories of the early days of drag racing and actually the formative years of the performance industry and drag racing and everything that went along with it. It's just an outstanding series of interviews. So I suggest that all of you go back and watch part 1 and 2 also. We finish up here tonight with part 3, and I'm thank you for being here. And we look forward to, in the future, the very near future, we're going to have Bob Moravez join us in an interview series. We're going to have Carl Olson join us in an interview series of the Cool and Olson fame. And I've just learned that Steve Reyes is also going to be joining us here in a couple of weeks, and that video won't be published for probably a month or so. So exciting things happening. Thanks for being here, everybody. I hope you enjoy the third segment of our interview with Don Prieto.
All the rules started to hit. The environmental rules, the EPA was involved, the California Air Resources Board was a major pain in the butt to the speed equipment business because they had no way to control it, so they wanted to ban it. So I got with Jim McFarland, who was really on top of this stuff at Edelbrock, and we had become friends when he was at Peterson, at Hot Rod Magazine. He's from Texas, I'm from Louisiana. It was a very close relationship, and he looked out for my career, and I looked out for his, and I helped him with what he was going to decide to put in the magazine, in the hot rod, and what have you. So I was learning from him, and I said, I want to do something about all these rules. He said, well, why don't you do a project? And so I thought about that, and I thought about an angle. And what I ended up doing was I took the motor out of my Nomad, Gray Baskerville had given me the motor out of his Roadster just because he wanted to get rid of it. So I rebuilt that motor with Jim's help, and we used all high performance parts. We took the car to the dyno facility at Clayton, and we tested it for emissions before we took it apart. And we got a baseline of what that car was capable of. And I ran it a drag strip, and I got times from the drag strip.
Yep.
So then we went through the motor, did a really first-class job. Farland gets the credit. He ordered all the pieces and told me what to do and what have you. I knew the hop-up part, but I didn't know the intricacies of piston rings and valve seats and all that kind of stuff. From that standpoint, I learned a lot.
Okay.
And we made this motor, and it really made a difference. The car picked up almost 2 full seconds in the quarter mile.
Wow.
And the other motor was kind of tired anyhow. But at 2 full seconds, about 8 miles an hour, and the emissions were really good.
Wow.
It was a great improvement. The system we were using was there was no EPA test at that time. They were still bickering over what they were going to use as a test.
Yeah.
And so I used their test, and I promoted their test, which was called the 7 mode. And I explained the whole thing in an article because they were giving me the information. I put that in the magazine so that everybody could understand what the results were and how tricky this motor was from an emission standpoint, with minor adjustments on the ignition and on the jets and the idle screws in the carburetor.
Yeah.
Idle was a big piece of the emissions.
Okay.
So I published that story, and the sky fell in.
Oh.
Eklund, Axel, Holly, Carter, all of those people are sending letters to Alex. What a great piece. We really needed this to help our industry along. And it feathered my cap in the Peterson house. And also word got out that I was doing this.
Yeah.
I always gave McFarland the credit he deserved because he came up with the idea, planted the seed with me. I made it happen, but he did a lot of application of his knowledge that he had gotten at Edelbrock building manifolds.
Yeah.
So it was really a mutual program, but I got the credit for putting it in the magazine the way I did. And the cover said, Hot Rod Editor, HRIN editor builds clean air engine with high performance parts. That went right to the point. And so the Air Resources Board was interested in what I was saying. They were interested in the folks that were doing the testing at Clayton Dynamometer. And it just created a feeling amongst the small industry that it was at the time, that something's happening. We know that these people want to make the rules, but we have to participate. And my editorial was, if you don't pay attention now, you won't be able to pay attention later.
Yeah.
And because they'll make the rules by themselves, and you won't have anything to say about it. And then you won't be able to comply because you don't know what the hell they're talking about. And so that went along, and I kept doing the magazine, and I kept everybody up to date with all the rules, the noise rules and what have you.
Yeah.
And then Edelbrock got elected to chairman of SEMA.
Yeah.
and SEMA wasn't doing much of anything. They had a guy named Eric Grant who was a lawyer for some of the parts manufacturers, and he was kind of the quasi head. And they had some committees, but they weren't active.
Yeah.
So when Vic got elected, he told Grant to do the lawyer part, stay on, do the lawyer part, but I'm going to put Bainey in there. Simultaneously, Bainey had lost the dealership, went to work for Paul Schieffer
Yeah.
to help all along when his health was failing, and and Schieffer was part of got bought by Hearst, and they wanted to move it to Warminster, Pennsylvania, and said, Bainey, would you move to Pennsylvania? He says, not on your life. So they took the dealership, they took the Schieffer thing back east, and Bainey was out of work. So Vic called him and said, would you take over SEMA and make it into something? And Bainey says, yeah, well, I'll need some help, but yeah. So Vic called me, and he said, we'd like you to come to SEMA and be the director of communications and be the guy that makes the connection with the manufacturers and the racers, because the racers were in trouble too, because they had all these specs that NHRA was requiring.
Yeah.
The chassis program, the wheel program, the explosion in cans, all that stuff.
Yeah.
And so that was all a burden to SEMA, but the people that were running it knew nothing about it.
Yeah.
Well, Bainey was in on the racer part, and I was in on the rules making part. We made a hell of a team.
Yeah.
We went to places like Wisconsin and New Jersey and Oregon, who made rules that said you can't be putting wheels and tires on these cars and jacking them up and what have you. And that's not true. You can do that, but you gotta limit it, and you gotta use limits that are common sense. So Vic talked to Peterson, said we need a lobbyist in Washington, and they hired Dale Hogue, and he paid the first year. I think it was 35 grand retainer, which was a lot of money in those days. And he was included in all this stuff, and he understood cars, and he understood me. Like I'm talking to you, I talked to him like that, and he said, "Oh, we can do this, and we can do that." And so in Wisconsin and New Jersey and places like that, when they made these rules, they sent me. Well, I would tell the lawyer what Dale Hogue was his name. I'd tell him what the problem was, and he'd tell me the solution. He'd say, "Well, you got to work the height rule within the OEM bumper regulations.
Yeah.
If you have an emissions issue, then you have to test that piece of equipment, and you have to make you just can't ban it because it's interfering in interstate and foreign commerce."
Yeah.
Which is what he knew about it. I didn't know anything about that. So he laid that on me, and I would get an expert from the manufacturer and take them with me. One of them was Jim Cavanaugh he was appliance plating at the time. I took him, it was a wheel problem in Oregon. And he and I went up to Oregon and dazzled the legislature with the stuff we knew about wheels and how we do the testing and all of this stuff. And we came back and they made the rules according to what we told them. And what we told them was what Dale Hogue told me to tell them. So Oregon people now had a free hand to keep doing what they were doing. They just couldn't get outrageous about it. You know?
Yeah.
And so that was a really successful program. In the meantime, Bainey was working the rules making for dragsters and wheels and all that stuff.
Yeah.
And the most important thing was he had so much clout in the industry that he could talk to a guy, call up a manufacturer and say, "Send me your dues." And he'd go, "What?" We need you to be part of this organization. Send me your dues. How much is it? How much gross do you do? Well, we do 14 million. Well, your dues is such and such. Send me a check. And he would pressure these people to join the association because it was for their own good. And they knew it. They were just too lazy to do it on their own.
You
So,
know, it's funny you talking about SEMA. I just did an article, a short little clip of an article. I was emailing with a couple of SEMA executives, including the CEO, and over the RPM Act right now. You know, with the whole emissions thing and all the damage it's going to do to the motor racing industry. So I just put up a whole call to action on the website with you know, let's do something here to save. I, you know, essentially, for those of you who don't understand, and I know you probably know this, Don, but for people who are watching, the RPM Act is attempting to allow cars, a street car, a highway car, to be modified to become exclusively a race car. Say you buy a car from the factory and you want to take it out on the drag strip and race it. Right now, according to the EPA, you can't do that. You can't modify that car and take the emission stuff off it. So that's the battle they're fighting, and it's a legislative battle, and they're trying to get this law passed. So it's been interesting working with SEMA.
the next step for me, having been successful in doing this stuff for Hot Rod Industry News along that line that you're talking about. I was the communications guy. I wrote columns in National Dragster and Drag News and whatever publication would run it every month, talking about what the rules are going to do to you if you don't pay attention.
Yeah.
And here's how you do it and what you should do. And it was manufacturer specific. In other words, I'd say to the head of guys, you're going to be in the lawn furniture business if you don't pay attention. and I had gathered committees for each one of these areas. And McFarland and I, again, in cahoots with Edelbrock, we decided to do a 3-car test. We took a Ford, a Chevy, and a Chrysler, 66 models, and we did the same thing as we did with the Nomad, my Nomad for the test for the magazine.
Yeah.
And the idea was to put an ignition, an intake manifold, a set of headers, and a camshaft. And the matrix of that, which means that every manufacturer was in part of a test and with the other components. So it wasn't brand specific. It was complete in that we got all of those things tested.
Yep.
And it took us 6 months.
Wow.
But the manufacturers that participated paid for it. The guy that owned Doug's Headers, he bought the car. Vic bought the Chevy. I forget who bought the Ford, but they all participated.
Yeah.
And they sent their parts. And Edelbrock had his mechanics install the pieces with the supervision from Ollie Morris from Offenhauser and Brad Anderson from the Header Company and the Holly guy from Holly and the Carter guy from Carter. And it was really a comprehensive test. When we got all done, it was like 60 pages of information.
Wow.
And we presented that to the EPA, showing them how these components that we have added to these cars improve the situation. And they didn't know what they didn't know what to think.
Yeah.
Well, Dale Hogue talked me into moving to Washington and going to work for APAA and do the same thing for them in Washington.
Yeah.
The money was a whole bunch better. And while I hated it back there,
Yeah.
it was a great career move.
Yeah.
I essentially wrote all of the requirements in the Title II portion of the Clean Air Act
Yeah.
with input from everybody.
Yeah.
Like once I got there, I developed the those same kinds of committees, but with heads of captains of industry, guys
Yeah.
from Champions, Plug, and Eklund, and people like that. And I also did a Vega project for APAA that they funded, and other manufacturers pitched in parts
Yeah.
and got the same kind of results. We improved the emissions by 10%. We improved the mileage by 40%.
Oh, wow.
And that was incredible. Guys at Eklund couldn't believe it. And we used a New York testing lab, and where they tested the taxi cabs at the outset.
Yeah.
And I improved the nitrous oxides results so much that they wanted to know what I was doing. You can't get that low in nitrous oxide. I had a water injector on the motor, and it knocked the heat off of the combustion process, and the nitrous oxides went away. I didn't tell them that, but that's what I was doing. And they couldn't tell by what way I did it, because I drilled a hole in the side of the carburetor and I screwed a jet in there and I ran a line to it.
Yeah.
Lines running the carburetors all over the place. So I tested there at that lab for a while, but then it got cumbersome because I had to drive from Washington, what have you. So
Yeah.
Eklund volunteered to use their lab, and they had full CVS facility.
Yeah.
And so we did the test on that Vega, and we used all the information I had gathered. And I wrote the requirements for the Title II of the Clean Air Act when I left town in 1978.
Okay.
They still have not published. To this day, they haven't published that information because they don't know how it happened. How can this be that a bunch of guys on the street can make a car better than it came from the factory? It was really simple. We were narrowing the envelope.
Yeah.
That was the point of the discussion, that the factories have an envelope of tolerances, and the resultant car makes a certain amount of emissions.
Yeah.
If you reduce the envelope, take away some of those variances in the tolerances that are built in,
Yeah.
things improve. And that's what we did. And that's what we explained to them. We're improving the performance of the vehicle, and here's the results. So I finally got tired of Washington. I had 3 years of it, and I just aggravated. And I went to.
I don't know how you lasted 3 years in that snake pit.
It was really awful, but I did meet Ford and President Ford, and I met Jimmy Carter, which was not a big a deal. But it was nice to be around that power. I met a lot of guys, Lloyd Benson and various senators that were on committees that I've interfaced with.
Yeah.
And it was nice being in amongst those powerful people.
Yeah.
But it just smacked of corruption, and I was not cut out to be that way. And the people that lived in Washington were in transit.
Yeah.
They were either coming to get powerful or they were leaving because they weren't. And then nobody knew anything about cars, and they didn't care less. So I went to, I spoke to the Mascadax, which is the Madison Avenue Sports Car Driving and Chowder Society in Washington at Sardi's. And I gave this speech about the Vega and what we did and the net results. And I had done these little talks to people in groups before. And this particular group that was high dollar ad agency people and people in the advertising business and what have you, and it was started by Walter Cronkite, I believe. But
Oh,
it was car connected, and it was advertisers. And when I got through, they threw rolls at me, and I was offended that they threw these rolls. And my friend Earl Gandell says, "No, they liked your speech. If they don't like the speech, they don't do anything." So that was stark. And at that luncheon, Dick Bauer, who was a friend of mine, introduced me to Earl Gandell and said they're looking for a product guy on the West Coast to be Toyota's. Their Toyota agency, Dancer Fitzgerald Sample, needs this car person to keep them from doing something stupid in their advertising. And the guy that's doing it is leaving. Would you be interested? I said, in a New York minute. I'll be glad to go. And so that's how I got hired. I actually got hired at the 78 Watkins Glen Formula One race.
okay.
I had gone up there to witness the race, and I interviewed with the people from Dancer Fitzgerald at the race because Toyota sponsored the race, and they were going to be there and
Yeah.
they hired me. And so I got back to California, and I was just tickled as I could be because I could get back to doing what I wanted, and this job was going to pay good and what have you. So when I went to work at the ad agency, Don Cressweller, who was the ad salesman for Speed and Custom Dealer, which was the other trade magazine that competed with Hot Rod Industry News.
Yeah.
And he says, "How about you write a column for us in the Babcock's publication?" I said, "Sure. I have more freedom to deal with the aftermarket being a representative of the factory
Yeah.
than I would if I was freelance. I can say whatever the hell I want." So I wrote pretty interesting columns. And the column that sticks out in my mind was that the headline was "Not Legal for Sale in the United States." And I went on about what these rules have done to the aftermarket industry and how they're really causing them a great deal of grief to a business that don't deserve it.
Yeah.
And that was the kind of tack I took. And I would occasionally attack somebody like the warehouse distributors were having way too much power
Yeah.
in the aftermarket. And Johnny Toll was part of that deal.
Yeah.
And I would take them to task, like Don Smith and people that from Champion Speed Shop. They were exercising too much strength over the manufacturers,
Yeah.
and I took them to task about that. And of course, I got caught. Woomer from Competition Specialties in Seattle called me up. He says, "Can you come up here?" I said, "Sure. When do you want me to be there?" He says, "Come up for the race in Seattle and we'll talk." He wanted to grind me about what I had said about the warehouse guys. Same thing happened with Joey Amato.
Yeah.
With
I knew this was coming. I knew this was coming.
with Lanny and the guys that were running the Keystone, and I said something really derogatory about the way they treated the manufacturers at the warehouse distributor conferences, where they just ground on them for an extra $5 and that kind of stuff. So I exposed all of that, or I thought it was exposing it, and it got everybody's attention. And Joey Amato called me and said, "We send you a ticket. We want you to come back here and see this operation." So I went back there, and they gave me the full tour. And they were having a warehouse event at the time where they were bringing customers, both speed equipment warehouse guys, I'm not warehouse guys, speed equipment business people,
Yeah.
and racers and stuff. So the place was full. And it was a pretty impressive proposition. So I went back and I wrote how Joe had asked me to come back there, and I looked at this operation. They got this many trucks, and they got this many people, and they do this kind of business, and they got cranks, and they got everything they need. I said, but they still grind on people for that extra 5
Yeah.
at the end of the piece. And what I did was deflate what he attempted to do was to influence me
Yeah.
into something nice about Keystone. And I did. I, I praised them highly for their operation and the way they did it, and the computer, and the way they structured their pricing and everything. I said, but you never showed me anything that would change my mind about the way you treat the manufacturer.
Hmm.
And that, of course, that put me on that side of Joey Amato, as you can well imagine. So
I,
what's next? What would you like?
well, speaking of Joe, he was one of the first people I ever interviewed doing all this, and uh, he's an interesting guy. And I'll tell you what, I just as far as the racing side of it goes, man, that guy is a type A personality to the extreme.
Boy,
He is a go getter.
yeah. Well, his organization reflected that,
Yeah,
and did really well.
yeah.
I mean, you can't take that away from him.
No, and that's why, when I interviewed him, the title of the interview when I finally published it was Joe Amato, an American success story, because that's really what the story of Joe Amato is, grinding it out from a little shop in Pennsylvania. So anyway, um, I guess since we're getting long here, what I'd like to do is I'd like to ask you, you know, what are you up to now? Are you part of the Nitro Revival, the California Hot Rod Reunion? I know you've got do you still have the Hustler?
I still have the Hustle, and I have the Ivo single engine Buick,
Okay.
and now have a 300-inch Chrysler with the Scott fuel injected I raced when I was with Mad.
Okay.
And I'm not sure where that's going to go, but it'll go somewhere. And I'm pals with Gibbs and the Nitro Revival. I'll be there with both cars. I got friends coming down from Denver
Good.
to help me because I can't do it all by myself.
Yeah.
And we we do this on a regular basis. I had lunch today with Don Long and Bruce Dida and Bill Miller from the American Hot Rod Foundation. He was there, and we had a nice lunch and talked about stuff. You know, we're preparing to go to the Thursday night before the Winter Nationals. Brent Cannon has a gathering of Top Fuel and Top Gas drivers and owners and what have you.
Okay.
And we go to Vince's Spaghetti House, and everybody's got to talk. Everybody gets to say what they're doing. And he goes around the room and he points them out. And we usually take Iski with us. John Rasmussen, Don Long, me, Bones, Bala, and Iski. And we'll go out there and participate. And that's what we were planning today as we moved along. Saturday night we gather, and sometimes I start up something. Sometimes Iski starts up something, verbally, but I'll start a motor or two and what have you.
Yeah.
And I spend my days playing with my toys. I have the two dragsters. I have a 32 Roadster with a Lexus running gear, and I have a 56 Nomad that is Tim Gibson, a chief engineer at on Danny Thompson's Streamliner.
Okay.
I let him drive it. He says, this is the first hot rod I've ever drove like a passenger car. In other words, they didn't have any of the idiosyncrasies of it being all hopped up and what have you. He said they just drove down the boulevard, but I got world-class suspension under it, and Edelbrock used it as the prototype for the Pro 4 fuel injector,
Okay.
and it's got a 5-speed in it, and it's a really nice car. I mean, it's dead stock outside except for the American wheels
Uh,
and the push bar for the Ivo cars on the front. That's a little bit different, and that's what I do, and I haven't had the time of my life. It's really been fun. I thoroughly enjoy my participation in the industry. I get folks like you calling me on a regular basis. Often they don't necessarily want to do an interview, but they need some information and they'll
yeah.
send pictures of cars. And I have an uncanny ability to recognize a small portion of a dragster that'll tell me who it is.
Yeah.
And when I'm on the Facebook or email or what have you, I recognize those cars, and the guys say, "How do you do that?" I don't know how I do it. I just have that a good memory, an exceptional memory, and I
Well,
was there all the time. I was in amongst them and doing it, and I just was thoroughly steeped in the world of drag racing, in the best time of drag racing, which was from '55 to '72. That was the best time.
well, speaking of 72, this is the question I ask everybody that I interview who's a West Coast guy. Were you at Lions December 2nd, 1972 for the last race? Were you there for that?
Absolutely. Yeah. Dick Van Cleve, Patty, and I, and Dick's wife went to uh, the last drag race, and we were there till the last dog died. It was something else.
So Carl Olson is one of those guys that I communicate with on a regular basis, and he's probably been the guy who's given me the most eyes forward look at what happened at Lions. I mean, him talking about crunching over beer cans trying to get up to the staging lanes, but the
Yep.
atmosphere, and Don Ewald told me one time that he said the atmosphere was like this bipolar atmosphere of the fans in the crowd were excited, yet if you went back in the pits, it was like a funeral back there. What's your memory of what it just the entire atmosphere of that race?
Uh, it was the end of an era,
Yeah.
and you could sense that it was an end of an era, and you were looking for a crescendo. You were looking for the guy who was going to play the cymbals at the end, to where there's a big clash,
Yeah.
big kaboom, and that was this essentially how it felt.
Okay.
And we went to Nick's after the race. That's the place we hung out,
Yeah.
and we all had too much to drink, and we were celebrating the fact that it ended, and we were just living it. It was a sad day, but it was a great finish.
Yeah.
Nobody got hurt. There wasn't any rioting. They did tear down all the fences and stuff like that. Everybody wanted to jump them,
Yeah.
and for the most part, they got it, and nobody stopped them. And it was just very, very uh, upbeat, but sad.
Yeah. And
And
and you know what? That's exactly the way I've heard it described too. A great atmosphere, yet it was a downtime. But the one thing that as I review history, I don't know how else to say it. As I study the history of all this, eh, I was a pretty young kid in 1972, but clearly I've always thought that when Lions closed in 72, not only did it mark a change and an end of an era in drag racing, it felt like that was a turning point just in the country in general. The Vietnam War was coming to an end. Just things were changing just in general right in that whole time. So it all kind of fits together in the American story.
the build up to that was Garlett's having his accident,
Yeah.
and moving the entire program, and I mean the entire program, from front engine fuel dragsters that were very dangerous to rear engine dragsters that were not quite so dangerous, and the performance level started to leap.
Yeah.
And manufacturers started to see the benefits of advertising with these people, and it essentially exploded.
Yeah.
The the racetracks that still existed saw huge crowds. If you see pictures of Orange County when they were running 64 car shows, there was no place to sit.
Yeah.
And that was it. They were trying to find stands all over town to put in addition to what they already had.
Yeah.
It was a really great time, but I think the association really didn't manage that growth potential.
Yeah.
They concentrated too much on keeping as much money as they could.
Yeah.
And they did things like stopping the racers from selling T-shirts in the pits, and then they finally allowed it, but they wanted a piece of it,
Yeah.
and they did things like that were not in the racers' interest, but it wasn't affecting the racing. The racing was good. It
Yeah.
just got too expensive. And the reason it got expensive is because they didn't manage the rules properly.
Yeah.
There was a lot of people that were giving them advice as to how to manage the rules, and they didn't. And it's got to the point to where we're all making a pool as to when it's going to explode. It
Yeah.
looks like Camping World is going to save their ass because they really understand what's going on.
Yeah.
And the National Dragster jumped from a rag that nobody read to a book that you can hardly carry around with advertising, and we don't know why. Gibson and I talk about this quite a bit because we're trying to get a top field program going, and he he says, why is this magazine taking off? I said, because it's being driven by Camping World. They see a large batch of people that have motorhomes and trucks and trailers and stuff, and that's their customer. And
Yeah.
here they are all in one place. So throw money at it. Now, my understanding about Camping World's reputation is that they're a high priced operation
Yeah.
when you compare it with other camping groups like the bass fishing people and stuff like that.
Yeah.
They're much more reasonable in their pricing. Camping World is very high, and they don't provide things like a dump station at their facilities,
Yeah.
which is really silly because that's one of the most important things you do in a motorhome.
Well,
So I think the influence of Camping World will prolong NHRA's livability.
yeah.
How long it'll last, I don't know. I don't think there's any end to Camping World's deal, but NHRA will get greedy and they'll start charging them more than they should be, and they'll find out that it's not that cost effective anymore. That sort of thing.
Yeah.
That's what happens to the people that were involved. You know,
Well, I one of the things right now, as far as your common, your Sunday racer fan, just your average fan, is simply the pricing at the track. My wife and I went to the Arizona Nationals last year for the 3 days. We the first day we sat right behind the starting line in the special pit, so I knew we were going to pay for that. But the next 2 days we sat right next to the tower on the right, on the left side of the track there. Our total bill just for tickets and parking was almost $1,000 for 3 days for 3 tickets, or for 4 tickets.
yeah.
So it's, somehow, in order for NHRA to continue to move forward with a fan base that shows up at races, they got to do something about all of this. And I don't know that they're willing to do that. I don't know if they're even listening.
I don't know that there's anybody connected with NHRA that's capable of thinking of a solution.
Yeah.
camping for people may guide them into it if they have as much influence in the future as they have had in the recent past.
Yeah.
They appear to be in a position to do that. Will they listen? Who knows?
Well, I think Steve Gibbs was probably the last true drag racing guy. I know Graham Light raced, but Steve Gibbs was probably the last true drag racing guy that worked for the NHRA.
Without question. And
So,
and Gibbs' organizational skills took NHRA a lot further
yeah.
than they would have otherwise. And he never raced. He didn't have a race car.
Yeah.
So he did all of that because he loved the sport and he knew what he was doing. And he was a guy that could get along in adversity, in and amongst adversity,
Yeah.
because there's so many hostile racers out there because of the way they're treated that he had to survive all that stuff.
Yeah.
And that's, believe me, to try and keep your job when there's 40 people trying to fix it so that you don't have it, it's a real task, man.
Well, I guess I do this. I've been passionate about drag racing since I was 8 years old. My uncle took me to my first drag race. You know, I had that crazy uncle that used to slip me super stock and hot rod magazines under the door when my dad wasn't looking, and I'd go hang the posters all over my wall in my room. But he was instrumental in me falling in love with drag racing. And we used to go to Union Grove, Wisconsin, here to Great Lakes Dragaway, and I spent my youth down there every chance I could be there to watch those races. And I just developed this passion and this need now to understand the inside of what was going on back then. And I'm starting to accumulate all these little interconnections, and you're just full of interconnections and little pieces. And that's what keeps me doing this. Is I know, based on the people that are looking at these videos, 25, 30,000 people checking out these interviews, that people are interested in this too. And that's why I think it's important for guys like you to come on and speak and carry this forward
I
for
hope
the
I
next
didn't bore them
generation.
to tears. I certainly didn't intend to bore them with some of my past, but hopefully it was informative, if not significant, let's say.
It
So I appreciate you
it's good
asking
stuff.
me to do this. I'm glad I was able to participate, sir.